The gold fountain pen scratched against the heavy linen paper with a sound like a knife carving into bone. James Park didn't just sign documents, he executed them. Sitting in his office on the 45th floor of the sleekest skyscraper in New York City, he looked down at the contract that had been ruining his life for the past 6 months. It was a marriage agreement, a relic from a promise his grandfather had made decades ago to a dying friend, binding the heir of the Park empire to the daughter of a nobody. James hated it. He hated the lack of control, he hated the sentimentality, and most of all, he hated her. He had never met Dr. Sarah Mitchell, but he knew exactly what she was. A gold digger. A leech waiting to attach herself to his family's fortune under the guise of honor and tradition. He ripped a check out of his checkbook, the sound sharp and final in a silent room. $5 million. That was the price of his freedom. He would go to her, he would hand her this check, and he would tell her that the wedding was off. If she had any pride, she would take it. If she didn't, well, James had lawyers who could make her life a living hell. He stood up, buttoning his charcoal suit jacket, his reflection in the glass window showing a man who was undeniably handsome, but colder than the winter wind whipping through Manhattan. If you want to see how a man who thought he could buy everything learns that some hearts have no price tag, make sure you subscribe right now, because this collision is about to get messy. James took the private elevator down to the garage, ignoring the bowing staff. He didn't want a driver today. He needed the aggression of the engine, the control of the steering wheel. He slid into his matte black sports car, the leather groaning softly, and punched the address into the GPS. He expected it to be a trendy apartment in Brooklyn, or maybe a desperate studio in Queens. But the navigation system drew a line straight north, past the gentrified neighborhoods, past the parks, deep into the Bronx. James frowned. Why would a woman trying to marry a billionaire live there? He gunned the engine, the car roaring out of the garage like a beast released from a cage. The drive was a descent into a different world. The gleaming glass towers of his life faded, replaced by brick buildings with peeling paint and streets lined with overflowing trash cans. The deeper he drove, the tighter his grip became on the steering wheel. He felt out of place, a diamond in a coal mine, and the feeling made him angry. This woman was clearly playing a long con, living in squalor to garner sympathy. It was pathetic. He pulled up to the address, a crumbling brick building that looked more like a fortress than a home. A faded sign above the door read, St. Jude's Community Clinic and Shelter. James checked the GPS again. This was it. He turned off the engine, the silence inside the luxury car contrasting sharply with the noise of sirens in the distance. He grabbed the check, tucked it into his inside pocket, and stepped out. The air smelled of exhaust and old rain. He locked the car, feeling the eyes of people on the street burning into his expensive suit, and walked toward the entrance. He wasn't here to make friends. He was here to end a mistake. The moment he pushed open the heavy double doors, the noise hit him like a physical wave. It wasn't the sterile beep of medical machines he was used to in his private hospitals. It was the sound of life. Screaming babies, coughing old men, children running through the halls, and the frantic shouting of overwhelmed staff. The waiting room was packed wall to wall with people who looked like they hadn't seen a doctor in years. James stood in the doorway, stunned. The floor was scuffed linoleum, the walls were covered in children's drawings, and the air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and desperation. He scanned the room, looking for a woman who looked like she was waiting for a payout. He expected someone polished, someone trying too hard. Instead, he saw chaos. A nurse ran past him carrying a stack of files, almost knocking him over. "Move or help, buddy," she yelled over her shoulder. James stiffened. No one spoke to him like that. He marched toward the reception desk, dodging a toddler with a sticky face. "I am looking for Dr. Sarah Mitchell," he announced, his voice cutting through the din. The receptionist, a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in a week, pointed a pen toward a set of double doors at the back. "Trauma room 1, but she's busy." James didn't wait. He wasn't used to waiting. He strode past the desk, ignoring the receptionist's protests, and pushed through the doors. The room behind was quieter, but the tension was higher. And there she was. James stopped dead in his tracks. Sarah Mitchell wasn't wearing a designer dress, she wasn't wearing makeup, she was wearing oversized blue scrubs that were stained with something dark, her hair was pulled back in a messy bun that was falling apart, and she looked exhausted. She was bent over a small bed, where a young boy, maybe 7 years old, was crying in pain. His leg was bleeding badly. Sarah was working with a speed and focus that was terrifying. Her hands, gloved and bloodied, moved with precise, rhythmic grace. "I need more gauze and 5 cc's of lidocaine now," she commanded, her voice husky and authoritative. A nurse scrambled to obey. James watched, the check in his pocket suddenly feeling very heavy. This wasn't a gold digger lounging in a spa. This was a soldier in the trenches. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, stepping into the light. Sarah didn't even look up. "Unless you're O-negative or holding a scalpel, get out of my light," she snapped, not breaking her rhythm as she stitched the boy's wound. James blinked. The audacity. "I am James Park," he said, louder this time, expecting the name to freeze the room. It didn't. Sarah tied a knot in the suture, wiped sweat from her forehead with her shoulder, and finally looked up. Her eyes were the first thing he noticed. They were a deep, warm brown, framed by thick lashes, but they were currently filled with a fierce, burning annoyance. She looked at him, at his $5,000 suit, his perfect hair, his arrogant stance. And she didn't swoon. She didn't gasp. She looked disappointed. "Congratulations," she said dryly, turning back to the boy. "Can you hold this kid's hand while I finish, or are you just here to pose?" James was floored. "I am here to discuss our situation," he hissed, glancing at the nurse who was staring at him, "privately." Sarah sighed, a sound of pure exhaustion. She finished the bandage, smoothed the boy's hair, and whispered something to him that made the crying stop. Only then did she strip off her gloves and turn to face James fully. She wasn't shorter than him, forcing her to look up, but she didn't seem small. She seemed like a giant. "I don't have time for situations, Mr. Park," she said, walking past him to the sink to scrub her hands. "I have 40 patients in the waiting room, the roof is leaking in the recovery ward, and I haven't eaten in 12 hours. So whatever you have to say it fast." James felt his anger returning. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the check. This is how he won. He always won with money. "I'm calling off the wedding," he said cold, holding the paper out. "This is $5 million. Take it as a severance package for your time. I expect you to sign the annulment papers by morning." The room went silent. The nurse gasped. Sarah stopped scrubbing her hands. The water ran into the sink, swirling pink. She turned off the tap slowly, dried her hands on a rough paper towel, and turned around. She looked at the check. Then she looked at James. For a second, he thought he saw tears. He thought he had broken her. He felt a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Then Sarah laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was a sharp, incredulous sound. She walked up to him, took the check from his hand, and looked at it closely. $5 million. That could fix the roof. That could buy vaccines for a year. James nodded, feeling superior. "It's yours. Just disappear." Sarah looked him dead in the eyes, and with a slow, deliberate motion, she ripped the check in half. Then in half again. She let the pieces flutter to the floor like expensive confetti. James stood frozen, his brain unable to process what had just happened. "I don't want your money, James," she said, her voice quiet but shaking with hidden rage. "And I don't want you. My father made a promise to your grandfather, and I honor my word. But if you want to cancel, go ahead. You explain it to them. But don't you dare come into my house and try to buy me like I'm one of your acquisitions." She stepped closer, invading his personal space, smelling of soap and rain. "Now get out. You're blocking the gurney." Before James could respond, before he could unleash the fury that was boiling in his chest, the double doors burst open again. "Doctor, we need you. It's the twins from the orphanage, bad fever, seizures." A paramedic rushed in, wheeling 2 small gurneys. Sarah's face shifted instantly from anger to professional focus. She forgot James existed. She ran to the gurneys, shouting orders. James stood there, surrounded by the torn pieces of $5 million, watching the woman he had dismissed as a parasite fight for the lives of 2 children who meant nothing to the world. He should have left. He should have walked out and never looked back, but his feet wouldn't move. He watched her work, watched the sweat drip down her temple, watched the tenderness in her hands. And for the first time in his life, James Park felt something other than contempt. He felt a dangerous, terrifying spark of curiosity. He didn't know the truth yet, that these weren't just random orphans, and that Sarah was hiding a secret that would bring his entire empire to his knees. But that was a problem for later. Right now, the alarms were blaring, and the monitor on the little girl's gurney went flatline with a high-pitched whine. Sarah jumped onto the bed, starting CPR. "Don't you die on me!" she screamed. James took a step forward, his heart hammering in his chest. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a hero. But he suddenly realized he couldn't leave her to fight this alone. The high-pitched whine of the heart monitor was the only sound in the universe. James Park, a man who controlled billions of dollars with a whisper, stood paralyzed against the peeling yellow wall of the trauma room, watching a life-and-death battle that no amount of money could influence. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was no longer a woman to him. She was a force of nature. Her hands were locked on the small chest of the orphan girl, pumping rhythmically, her face a mask of fierce, terrifying determination. "Come on, Mia," she grunted, sweat dripping from her nose onto her mask. "Come back to me." 1 second, 2 seconds. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Then a gasp. The little girl's body arched and the monitor beeped, once, twice, then a steady, weak rhythm. The room exhaled. Sarah slumped forward, resting her forehead on the metal rail of the bed, her shoulders shaking. James felt a strange tightness in his own chest release. He hadn't realized he was holding his breath. He watched as Sarah whispered something to the child, smoothed the sweaty hair from the girl's forehead, and slowly straightened up. She looked like she had just fought a war. Her scrubs were ruined, her eyes were bruised with fatigue, and her hands were trembling. She turned, expecting the room to be empty, and froze when she saw James still standing there, watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "You're still here," she said, her voice raspy. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. James adjusted his cuffs, trying to regain the armor of his indifference, but it didn't fit as well as it had an hour ago. "My car is blocked in," he lied smoothly, "and I don't walk in the rain." Sarah stared at him for a beat, too tired to argue. She walked past him, stripping off her gloves with a snap. "Don't touch anything," she muttered, pushing through the swinging doors into the hallway. James followed. He told himself it was because he had nothing better to do until the rain stopped. He told himself he just wanted to make sure she understood the wedding was off. But deep down, he knew that was a lie. He followed her because for the first time in years, he had seen something real, and he couldn't look away. He found her in a small, cramped office at the end of the hall. It was a chaotic mess of patient files, medical journals, and empty coffee cups. Sarah was sitting on a squeaky chair, her head in her hands. She looked small now, stripped of the adrenaline. James stood in the doorway, feeling intrusive. "You saved her," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. Sarah looked up, her eyes flashing. "For tonight," she said bitterly. "She has a congenital heart defect. She needs surgery I can't perform here and equipment I can't afford. So don't give me a medal, Mr. Park. Give me a miracle." James looked around the office. He saw the overdue notices pinned to the corkboard. Electric bill, water bill, medical supply invoices, red ink everywhere. "You're drowning," he observed coldly. "Why do you stay here? With your skills, you could be at Mount Sinai making 7 figures. Sarah laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Because they don't have insurance," she said, pointing to the door. "Because if I leave, Mia dies. If I leave, half this neighborhood has nowhere to go. But a man who buys and sells companies wouldn't understand loyalty, would he?" The insult landed, but before James could retort, a heavy pounding on the front door shook the building. The clinic was closed for the night, the waiting room empty. Sarah stiffened, fear flashing across her face instantly. It wasn't a medical emergency, it was the fear of a hunted animal. "Whisper here," she said quickly. James wasn't a man who took orders. He followed her out into the dim hallway. Through the glass of the front door, he saw 3 men. They weren't patients. They were wearing leather jackets, soaking wet from the rain and holding baseball bats. One of them kicked the door again. "Open up, Doc. We know you're in there." Sarah stopped in the middle of the hallway, her hands clenching into fists. James stepped up beside her, his brow furrowed. "Friends of yours?" he asked dryly. "Loan sharks," she hissed, her voice trembling with shame. "To keep the clinic open last month, I had to borrow. I thought the state grant would come through. It didn't." James felt a cold rage settle in his stomach, not at Sarah, but at the situation. He watched as Sarah walked to the door, unlocked it, and stepped out into the rain to face them. She was insane. She was 5'0" facing 3 thugs. James didn't think. He didn't weigh the pros and cons. He simply walked out behind her. The leader of the group, a man with a jagged scar on his cheek, was shouting in Sarah's face.
"Time's up, princess. You pay or we start breaking equipment, or maybe we break you." Sarah stood her ground, though she was shaking. "I need one more week," she pleaded. "Please, I have sick children inside." The man laughed and raised the bat. "Not my problem." He swung. Sarah flinched, closing her eyes. But the blow never landed. James had stepped forward, catching the bat in his hand with a grip like iron. The sound of wood hitting his palm was dull and heavy. The thug looked up, shocked to see a man in a bespoke suit standing in the mud of the Bronx. James looked at him with eyes that were deadlier than any weapon. "Let go," the thug snarled, trying to pull the bat back. James didn't budge. "Do you know how much this suit costs? More than your life." He pulled out his wallet with his free hand, not breaking eye contact. He extracted a black credit card, the kind that had no limit, the kind only 50 people in the world owned. "How much does she owe?" James asked. The thug blinked, confused by the shift. 50 grand, he stammered, "with interest." James scoffed. "Pocket change." He tossed the card at his chest. "There's an ATM 3 blocks down. Take 60, keep 10 for a frantic lesson in manners. If you ever come back here, I won't call the police. I'll buy the building you live in and evict you into the river." The thugs scrambled away, clutching the card like it was a holy relic. Silence descended on the street, broken only by the rain. Sarah stared at James, her mouth slightly open. She looked from his face to his hand, which was red from catching the bat. "You—" she started, but the words failed her. She was furious, relieved, and confused all at once. "I didn't ask you to do that," she finally snapped, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't need a savior." James wiped his hand on a handkerchief, looking at her with a new intensity. "You clearly do," he countered. "But that wasn't charity, Dr. Mitchell. That was a down payment." Sarah frowned, the rain plastering her face to her hair. "A down payment on what?" James stepped closer, the distance between them closing. The air crackled with electricity. "On the wedding," he said. The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Sarah took a step back. "You tore up the check. You said you wanted to cancel." James looked at the clinic, then back at her. He saw the fire in her, the passion he had never found in his boardroom or his social circle. He saw a challenge. "I changed my mind," James lied. He hadn't changed his mind about the marriage. He still didn't want a wife, but he realized he couldn't leave her here to be destroyed. And more importantly, he wanted to know who she really was. "My grandfather is arriving in New York in 2 days. He expects to meet my fiancée. You need protection and money for this," he gestured to the crumbling building, "and I need a wife to secure my inheritance. So we make a deal." Sarah stared at him, shivering. "A contract marriage," she whispered, disgust warring with desperation. "You want to buy me after all." James shook his head. "No, I want to hire you. 1 year, you play the part of the loving wife. I pay off your debts and fund this clinic for a decade. After 1 year, we divorce quietly. No emotions, no strings." He held out his hand, the rain dripping from his fingers. "Do we have a deal, Dr. Mitchell, or do you want to explain to Mia why she can't have her surgery?" Sarah looked at his hand. She looked at the clinic door where the orphans slept. She hated him. She hated his arrogance, his money, his power. But she loved those kids more than she hated him. She took a deep breath, swallowed her pride, and reached out. Her rough, calloused hand grasped his smooth, manicured one. 1 year, she vowed, her voice trembling, "and then I never want to see you again." James squeezed her hand, a strange jolt of heat shooting up his arm. "Agreed," he said. But as thunder rolled overhead, neither of them noticed the black sedan parked down the street, with a camera lens zooming in on their handshake. They thought they had just made a business deal. They didn't know they had just started a war with James's enemies, who were watching every move, and they certainly didn't know that the no emotions clause was the first rule they were going to break. The silence in the matte black sports car was heavier than the storm they had left behind in the Bronx. James drove with a terrifying precision, weaving through traffic as if the other cars were merely obstacles in his personal video game. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, gripping the door handle until her knuckles turned white. She was still wearing her blood-stained scrubs, a stark, violent contrast to the cream leather interior that smelled of sandalwood and money. She looked out the window as the city changed. The crumbling brick buildings vanished, replaced by the towering glass spires of Manhattan. She felt like she was being transported to a different planet, one where oxygen was replaced by currency. "We need to set some ground rules," James said, his voice breaking the silence without looking at her. "Rule number 1, you do not speak about the clinic in front of my grandfather. To him, you are a pediatrician at a private hospital, not a volunteer in a war zone." Sarah bristled, turning to glare at his profile. "I won't lie about who I am, James. My work isn't shameful." James shifted gears, the engine growling. "I didn't say it was shameful. I said it was inconvenient. My grandfather values power and prestige. Your poverty is not a virtue to him. It's a failure." The cruelty of his words stung, but Sarah swallowed the retort. She thought of Mia, the little girl with the failing heart. She thought of the $50,000 James had just paid to save her life. For Mia, she would swallow glass. "Rule number 2, James continued, pulling the car into a private underground garage that looked more like a museum than a parking lot. "Physical contact. We need to look like we're in love. Hand-holding, arm-linking, but do not mistake it for anything real. Do not get comfortable." He stopped the car and turned to face her. The garage lights cast sharp shadows across his face, making him look dangerous. "And rule number 3, tonight you are not Sarah Mitchell from the Bronx. You are the future Mrs. Park. Do not embarrass me." Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt, her eyes meeting his with a defiance that unsettled him. "I save lives for a living, James. I think I can handle a dinner party." She opened the door and stepped out, her worn sneakers squeaking on the polished concrete. She didn't know that the dinner party she was walking into was a shark tank, and she was the bait. The penthouse was obscene. That was the only word for it. It was a sprawling glass box floating in the sky, filled with modern art that looked like it cost more than her entire medical education. But there was no time to gawk. James was in efficiency mode. He snapped his fingers and a team of people appeared from nowhere. Stylists, hairdressers, makeup artists. They descended on Sarah like a flock of well-dressed vultures. "Burn the scrubs," James ordered, walking toward his office. "You have 2 hours. Make her look like a queen." Sarah wanted to protest, to scream that she wasn't a doll, but they were already hustling her into a bathroom that was larger than her apartment. For the next 120 minutes, she was scrubbed, polished, painted, and pinned. They stripped away the exhaustion of the clinic, hiding the dark circles under layers of expensive concealer. They tamed her wild, frizzy hair into sleek, glossy waves. And then, the dress. It was a midnight blue silk gown that flowed like water, simple yet devastatingly elegant. When Sarah stepped out of the dressing room, the chatter of the stylists stopped. She looked in the floor-to-ceiling mirror and didn't recognize herself. The woman staring back was powerful, stunning, and terrified. James was waiting in the living room, checking his emails on a tablet. He heard the footsteps and checked his watch. "You're 2 minutes late." The sentence died in his throat. He looked up, and for the second time that night, his brain stuttered. Sarah stood at the top of the stairs, the blue silk clinging to her curves, her shoulders bare, her chin held high. She didn't look like the tired doctor from the slums. She looked ethereal. James felt a sudden, sharp kick in his chest, a physical reaction he hadn't prepared for. He stood up slowly, the tablet forgotten in his hand. He meant to say something critical, something to reassert control. Instead, he whispered, "Acceptable." It was the highest praise he could give without breaking his own rules. Sarah walked down the stairs, struggling slightly in the towering heels. "I feel ridiculous," she muttered, tugging at the neckline. "I feel like an imposter." James walked over to her, stopping inches away. The scent of her, no longer antiseptic, now jasmine and vanilla, filled his senses. "That's the point," he said, his voice lower than usual. "Everyone in this world is an imposter, Sarah. We just wear better costumes." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a velvet box. Inside sat a diamond ring the size of a grape. He slid it onto her finger. It was cold and heavy. "Showtime," he whispered. The elevator doors opened directly into the private dining room of the Park Hotel, 50 floors above the city. The room was dimly lit, smelling of truffles and old wine. Seated at the head of the long table was Chairman Park. He was 80 years old, frail, hooked up to a portable oxygen tank, but his eyes were sharp as razors. Beside him sat a man James despised, his cousin, Daniel. Daniel was the reason James worked 80-hour weeks. He was the vulture waiting for James to slip up so he could take the CEO chair. When James and Sarah walked in, the conversation stopped. Daniel smirked, swirling his wine. Chairman Park didn't smile. He just watched. "Grandfather," James said, bowing slightly, "I would like to introduce you to Dr. Sarah Mitchell, my fiancée." Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but she remembered the deal. She forced a smile, stepped forward, and bowed respectfully. "It is an honor to meet you, Chairman," her voice steady. The old man stared at her for a long, agonizing minute. He looked at the dress, he looked at the ring, then he looked at her hands, the only part of her the stylists couldn't hide. They were rough, with short nails and tiny scars from years of needlework. "A doctor," the old man rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves. "James told me you were a surgeon, but your hands, they look like a laborer's hands." The insult hung in the air. Daniel chuckled. "Maybe she's a gardener on the weekends, grandfather." James stiffened, ready to intervene, but Sarah beat him to it. She didn't hide her hands. She placed them on the table, right next to the crystal wineglass. "You have a sharp eye, sir." She locked eyes with the old man. "My hands are rough because I don't just supervise, I work. These hands have restarted hearts, stitched wounds in the dark, and held the hands of dying children who had no one else. They aren't pretty, but they are strong. And I believe strength is what this family values, isn't it?" The silence that followed was deafening. James stared at her, stunned. She hadn't apologized. She hadn't cowered. She had turned her flaw into a weapon. The old man's eyes narrowed. Then slowly the corner of his mouth twitched upward. "Strength," he muttered. "Yes, we value strength." He gestured to the empty chair. "Sit." The first hurdle was cleared, but the dinner was a minefield. Daniel was relentless. He asked about her family, dead, schooling, state university, not Ivy League, and connections, none. Every question was a trap designed to expose her as a fraud. But Sarah, fueled by adrenaline and the wine she was sipping too quickly, parried every blow. She was charming, witty, and devastatingly honest in a way these people weren't used to. James found himself watching her not as a fake wife, but with genuine admiration. She was beating them at their own game. But then Daniel played his ace. He pulled out his phone and slid across the table. "It's a lovely story," he sneered, "but I'm confused. If they're so in love, why did my source at the bank tell me James withdrew $5 million this morning from the emergency account? And why was he seen entering a loan shark den in the Bronx 2 hours ago?"
The room froze. The air left the room. James gripped his fork so hard his knuckles turned white. He had been sloppy. He had underestimated Daniel's spies. The chairman looked at the phone, then at James. "Is this true?" the old man demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Did you buy her, James? Is this woman a transaction?" Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The contract, the deal, it was all about to unravel. If she admitted it, James lost everything. If she lied, they could easily prove it. She looked at James. He looks trapped, his mind racing for an excuse that wouldn't sound like a lie. He opened his mouth, but Sarah reached out and grabbed his hand. Her grip was tight, desperate. "He didn't buy me," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly but gaining strength. "He bought my safety." She turned to the chairman, improvising a story that was dangerously close to the truth. "I was in trouble. Debts from medical school, bad decisions. Dangerous men were threatening me. I tried to hide it from James because I was ashamed, but he found out. He didn't tell me, he just went there, into the mud and the rain, and he paid them off to protect me." She looked at James, and for a second she wasn't acting. She remembered him catching the bat. She remembered his rage on her behalf. Her eyes softened. "He didn't do it to buy a wife, Chairman. He did it because he's the kind of man who protects what is his. That's not a transaction. That's love." James stared at her. She had taken the worst moment of his day and spun it into a romantic epic. And the way she looked at him, it felt real. It felt too real. The chairman looked between them, studying their faces. He saw Sarah's hand clutching James's. He saw the intensity in James's eyes. Slowly, he pushed the phone back to Daniel. "You are a fool, Daniel," the chairman spat. "You see a bank transfer. I see a man taking action."
He looked at James. But words are wind. You say you love her. You say you protect her. The old man leaned forward, a cruel glint in his eye. Prove it. Kiss her. Not a peck on the cheek. Kiss her like you mean it. James froze. This wasn't in the contract. Rule number 2, no unnecessary contact. He looked at Sarah. She was wide-eyed, her breath hitching. They were trapped. If he hesitated, the charade was over. If he did it, he wasn't sure he could stop. He stood up, pulling Sarah to her feet. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. He pulled her close, his hand sliding up her bare back, feeling the heat of her skin through the silk. Her heart was beating against his chest like a trapped bird. "Do it," she whispered, barely audible. James didn't wait. He crashed his lips onto hers. He expected it to be awkward. He expected it to be a performance. But the moment they touched, the room vanished. Her lips were soft, tasting of wine and defiance. A jolt of electricity, hotter and more violent than anything he had ever felt, shot through his veins. He groaned low in his throat, deepening the kiss, pulling her tighter until there was no air left between them. Sarah's hands tangled in his hair, her body molding to his. It wasn't a pretend kiss. It was a collision. And for the first time, James Park wasn't in control. He didn't know the truth yet, that this kiss was the match that would burn his entire contract to ashes.
The elevator ride down from the 50th floor was agonizingly silent. James stood in the corner, staring at the digital numbers counting down, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle feathered in his cheek. Sarah stood on the opposite side, wrapping her arms around herself, her lips still tingling with a phantom heat. That kiss hadn't just blurred the lines, it had erased them. It was supposed to be a performance, a tactical maneuver to fool a suspicious old man, but performances don't leave you breathless. Acting doesn't make your heart race fast enough to bruise your ribs. When the doors pinged open in the garage, James walked out first, walking fast, putting distance between them as if she were radioactive. He unlocked the car, and they slid into the leather seats. The engine roared to life, masking the sound of their heavy breathing. That, James finally said, his voice rough and tight, was necessary. Don't read into it. Sarah looked out the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of gold and red. She felt humiliated and exhilarated all at once. "I didn't," she lied softly. "You're a good actor, James. For a moment, I almost believed you had a heart." James gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He didn't tell her that for a moment he had forgotten he didn't. They arrived back at the penthouse in silence, but the night was far from over. As they stepped into the foyer, James' phone buzzed. It was a text from Daniel. "Lovely show tonight, cousin. I hope the honeymoon suite is just as convincing. I'll be watching." James cursed under his breath. He showed the screen to Sarah. Her eyes went wide. "What does that mean?" she asked. James ran a hand through his perfect hair, messing it up for the first time. "It means Daniel isn't convinced. It means he has people watching the building, the staff, maybe even the cleaning crew. If we sleep in separate rooms tonight, he'll know by breakfast. And if he knows, the deal is off." Sarah looked at the stairs, then back at James. The realization hit her like a cold bucket of water. "You want me to sleep in your room?" she whispered. "In your bed?" James looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. "It's a king-sized bed, Sarah. We stay on our sides, we survive the night. Tomorrow I'll have security sweep the place for bugs. But tonight we have to play the happy couple until the lights go out." The master bedroom was vast, cold, and intimidating, just like its owner. The bed was an island of white linen in a sea of dark gray minimalism. Sarah went into the bathroom to change, scrubbing the expensive makeup off her face, desperate to find herself again underneath the layers of polish. When she came out wearing an oversized t-shirt she had packed in her emergency bag, James was already in bed. He was shirtless, reading a tablet, the sheet pulled up to his waist. Sarah faltered in the doorway. His chest was sculpted, scarred faintly on the shoulder, a detail she hadn't expected. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over her simple attire. "You look different," he murmured. "Better." He cleared his throat instantly, looking back at the screen. "Take the left side. I don't sleep with pillows, so take them all." Sarah climbed into the bed, keeping as close to the edge as possible without falling off. She grabbed the extra pillows and built a fortification down the center of the mattress. "The Great Wall of China," she announced, trying to keep her voice light. "You stay on your side, billionaire. I kick in my sleep." James actually cracked a smile, a rare, genuine thing that transformed his face. "Noted," he said, turning off the lamp. "Good night, Dr. Mitchell."
In the darkness, the silence was loud. They lay there, inches apart, separated by goose down and a contract. Sarah could hear his breathing. James could smell her shampoo. Neither of them slept. They both stared at the ceiling, terrified by the realization that the most dangerous thing in the room wasn't Daniel's spies. It was the person breathing next to them. The next morning, the truce was shattered by reality. Sarah woke up alone, the pillow wall demolished. She found James in the kitchen, fully dressed in another impeccable suit, drinking espresso while reading the Financial Times. The softness of the night before was gone, replaced by his corporate armor. "There's a car waiting downstairs. It will take you to the clinic. Your debt has been cleared. The transfer was made at 8 a.m. Sarah felt a pang of disappointment she couldn't explain. She wanted him to say, "Good morning." She wanted him to mention the night. "Thank you," she said stiffly, grabbing an apple. "I'll be late tonight. We have a vaccination drive." James nodded, finally looking at her. "Be back by 7. We have a gala on Saturday. The tailor is coming to fit your dress this evening." Sarah stopped at the door. "I'm not a doll you can dress up, James. I have a job." James's eyes flashed. "And this marriage is your second job. Read the contract, Sarah. Clause 4, public appearances." He was pushing her away, retreating into the safety of rules and money because he was scared of how comfortable he had felt waking up with her arm draped over his chest. Sarah glared at him. "Fine, but don't expect me to smile." She slammed the door. James watched her go, the silence of the penthouse suddenly feeling oppressive. He looked at his hand, the one she had held. He picked up his phone and dialed his assistant. "Send a delivery to St. Jude's Clinic. Lunch, for everyone. And send a contractor to fix their roof. Anonymous. If she finds out it's me, you're fired." The clinic was buzzing when Sarah arrived. The mood had shifted. The crushing weight of debt was gone, replaced by a cautious optimism. But the day was grueling. 12 hours of nonstop patients, flu season peaking, and a shortage of nurses. By 6 p.m., Sarah was running on fumes. She was stitching a cut on a construction worker's hand when the door opened. She expected a patient. Instead, a delivery team walked in carrying boxes of gourmet food from the most expensive deli in Manhattan. Behind them, a team of workers in coveralls arrived, carrying ladders and tools. "We're here for the roof repair," the foreman announced. "Paid in full." Sarah stood frozen. She knew exactly who had done this. She looked at the food, sandwiches that cost more than her daily budget, and felt a lump in her throat. James was an arrogant, controlling jerk, but he remembered. He listened. She pulled out her phone to text him, to say thank you, but her finger hovered over the screen. What could she say? Thanks for the roof, husband? Before she could type, a shadow fell over her desk. She looked up. Standing in the doorway of her cramped office was a woman who looked like she had just stepped out of a Vogue cover. She had platinum blonde hair, eyes like ice, and was wearing a white suit that remained miraculously spotless in the dirty clinic. It was Vanessa Sterling, the daughter of a senator, the woman the tabloids had always predicted James would marry, and she didn't look happy. "So," Vanessa said, voice smooth and venomous, "you're the little charity case James picked up." Sarah stood up slowly, wiping her hands on her scrubs. "Can I help you?" Vanessa stepped inside the office, looking around with undisguised disgust. "I'm not here for a checkup, sweetie. I'm here to give you a diagnosis. James doesn't love you. He's panicking because of his grandfather. You are a placeholder, a rental." She leaned over the desk, her perfume overwhelming the smell of antiseptic. "I've known James since we were children. I know what he wants, and he doesn't want a savior in scrubs. He wants a queen. Enjoy the penthouse while you can, because when the year is up, actually, I doubt you'll last a month." Vanessa dropped an envelope on the desk. "Open it," she commanded. Sarah hesitated, then tore it open. Inside were photographs. Photographs of James. But he wasn't alone. He was with Vanessa. They looked intimate, comfortable. But the dates were from last week. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "He didn't tell you?" Vanessa laughed softly. "We had dinner on Tuesday, the night before he proposed to you. He told me everything. He told me he needed a naive girl who wouldn't ask questions, someone he could pay off." Vanessa turned to leave, pausing at the door. "He's using you, Sarah, and when he's done, he'll come back to his real life. Don't fall in love with a shark. You'll only get eaten." Sarah stood alone in the office, the photos scattered on the desk. The joy of the roof repair, the confusion of the kiss, the warmth of the bed, it all curdled into a sick feeling in her stomach. Had he lied? Was she just the naive girl he mocked with his real girlfriend? The text on her phone from James lit up the screen. "Don't be late. The tailor is waiting." Sarah stared at it. Her sadness hardened into something cold, something sharp. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a placeholder. She grabbed her bag, leaving the photos on the desk. She would go to the penthouse. She would wear the dress. But the pillow wall was coming back tonight, and this time she was building it out of stone. She didn't know the truth yet, that the photos were old, staged by Daniel to break them apart. She walked out into the rain, her heart closing up like a fist. The war had just begun, and she was done playing nice.
The silence in the penthouse was different tonight. It wasn't the awkward silence of strangers or the comfortable silence of two people sharing a secret. It was the suffocating, heavy silence of a battlefield before the first shot is fired. Sarah stood in front of the mirror, the tailor pinning the hem of a gown that cost more than the entire St. Jude's Clinic. The dress was a masterpiece of emerald green velvet that hugged every curve of her body, leaving her shoulders bare and vulnerable. But Sarah's face was stone. She looked like a statue, beautiful, perfect, and completely hollow. James stood by the door, watching her. He was holding a long, thin velvet box, his thumb tracing the logo of a jeweler that served royalty. He had spent the entire day thinking about the roof, thinking about her smile when she saw the workers. He expected her to be happy. He expected warmth. Instead, she had returned from the clinic looking like she wanted to set the world on fire. "Leave us," James ordered the tailor. The woman nodded nervously, sensing the tension, and scurried out. James walked towards Sarah, the box heavy in his hand. He stepped behind her, catching her eye in the reflection. She didn't blink. "You look incredible," he said, his voice low. Sarah didn't turn. "I look expensive," she corrected, her voice flat. "There's a difference." James frowned. The rejection was sharp and immediate. He opened the box, revealing a diamond necklace that glittered like ice under the chandelier lights. "It belonged to my grandmother," he said, reaching around to fasten it. "She wore it on her wedding day. It's a tradition." He expected her to gasp. He expected her to be touched. Instead, Sarah flinched when the cold metal touched her skin. She grabbed his wrist, stopping him. "Don't," she whispered, finally turning to face him. Her eyes were burning with a mixture of grief and anger that stunned him. "Don't pretend, James. The contract says I have to wear the dress. It doesn't say I have to wear your family heirlooms." James pulled his hand back as if burned. "What is wrong with you?" he demanded, his patience snapping. "I fixed the roof. I cleared the debt. I'm trying to make this work." Sarah laughed, a broken, jagged sound. "Make it work? You mean make the transaction smoother. Save it for Vanessa. I'm sure she'd love the necklace. After all, she's the one you actually want." She pushed past him, grabbing her clutch. "Let's go. I have a performance to give." James stood frozen, the necklace dangling from his fingers. Vanessa. The name hit him like a physical blow. He didn't know the truth yet, that his cousin and his ex had orchestrated this misunderstanding with surgical precision. But as he watched Sarah walk out the door, he realized that the enemy wasn't outside the penthouse walls anymore. The enemy was in her head, and he was running out of time to get it out. The gala was a sea of flashing lights, fake smiles, and shark eyes. The ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was packed with New York's elite, senators, tech moguls, and socialites who would sell their souls for a cover on Vogue. When James and Sarah entered, the room went quiet. They were the golden couple of the season. James, devastating in his tuxedo, and Sarah, a vision in emerald green, her arm looped through his with a grip that was painfully tight. Cameras flashed like lightning. "Smile," James whispered through his teeth, waving to a donor. "You're doing great." Sarah plastered a smile on her face that didn't reach her eyes. "Clause 4, James. Public affection. I'm earning my paycheck." They moved through the crowd, a perfect picture of romance, while underneath the surface, they were bleeding. Across the room, Vanessa stood with Daniel, clinking champagne glasses. "Look at them," Daniel sneered. "She looks miserable. Good work with the photos." Vanessa smirked, sipping her drink. "The poor thing never stood a chance. Tonight we finish it. When I'm done, she'll run back to the gutter where she belongs, and James will be mine again." The night dragged on. Every handshake was a lie, every compliment a trap. Sarah felt like she was drowning in perfume and hypocrisy.
She excused herself to go to the balcony, needing air, needing to escape the suffocating weight of James's hand on her waist. The balcony was empty, the cold night air biting at her exposed skin. She gripped the stone railing, looking out at the city, fighting back tears. She wouldn't cry, not here, not over him. Enjoying the view, a voice dripped from the shadows. Sarah stiffened. It was Daniel. He walked into the light, a cigarette in his hand, looking at her like she was a bug he wanted to crush. "You clean up nice, Doc. Hard to believe you were begging for loan extensions." Sarah turned, her face hardening. "What do you want, Daniel?" He took a drag, blowing smoke in her direction. "I want to save you the embarrassment. James is going to dump you the second the grandfather signs the inheritance over. You're a prop, a rented womb. Everyone in that room knows it. Why wait for the humiliation? Leave now. I'll even call you an Uber." Sarah stared at him. The cruelty was breathtaking. But instead of breaking her, it woke something up. The same fire that made her stand up to loan arcs, the same fire that made her save orphans, roared to life. She stepped closer to him. "Do you think I'm scared of you?" she asked, her voice steady. "I deal with gang members and drug dealers in the ER every night. You're just a spoiled brat in a tuxedo." Daniel's face twisted in rage. He stepped forward, grabbing her arm. "Listen to me, you little—" "Get your hands off her." The voice was low, deadly, and vibrated through the stone floor. James stepped onto the balcony. He looked terrifying. His tie was loosened, his fists were clenched, and his eyes were black holes of fury. Daniel released Sarah instantly, stepping back with a nervous laugh. "Relax, cousin, we were just chatting." James didn't look at Daniel. He walked straight to Sarah, placing himself between her and his cousin. He looked at her arm and checking for bruises. "Did he hurt you?" he asked, his voice shaking with suppressed violence. Sarah looked up at him. She saw the rage. She saw the protectiveness. It didn't match the photos. It didn't match the lies. James. "Ladies and gentlemen," the voice boomed from the speakers inside, "please clear the floor for the first dance of the newly engaged couple." James ignored the announcement. He stared at Daniel. "If you ever touch her again," James whispered, "I will dismantle your life piece by piece. I will bankrupt you. I will erase you." Daniel paled, backing away into the ballroom. James turned to Sarah. The music was starting, a slow, haunting waltz. "We have to dance," he said, his anger fading into desperation. "Please, Sarah, talk to me." Sarah looked at the ballroom, then at him. She was confused, hurt, and exhausted, but she nodded. They walked back inside, the crowd parting for them. James pulled her into his arms. It wasn't the rigid hold of a contract. He pulled her close, pressing her against his chest, burying her hair in his hair. They moved to the music, isolated in a spotlight of lies. "Why did you say I wanted Vanessa?" James asked, his voice rough against her ear. "Why do you think this is fake for me?" Sarah closed her eyes, resting her head on his shoulder, too tired to fight. "Because I saw the photos, James. Tuesday night, you and her, intimate. You told her I was a placeholder." James stopped moving. In the middle of the dance floor, he stopped. The couples around them faltered. "Tuesday?" James pulled back, gripping her shoulders, staring into her eyes. "Tuesday, I was in Tokyo. I was closing the merger. I was on a video call with the board for 12 hours. Sarah blinked. "What?" James's eyes widened as the realization hit him. "The photos! Show me!" Sarah hesitated, then whispered, "Vanessa gave them to me." James looked toward the bar. Vanessa was gone. Daniel was smiling. "They were faked," James growled, the realization hitting him like a truck. "Sarah, I haven't seen Vanessa in 2 years. I swear on my life."
Sarah searched his face. She looked for the lie. She looked for the CEO who manipulated markets, but all she saw was a man who was terrified of losing her. Her heart stuttered. You were in Tokyo?" James nodded frantically. "Check my passport. Check the flight logs, Sarah. I don't want Vanessa. I don't want a queen." He stepped closer, ignoring the hundreds of people watching. "I fell in love with a woman in blood-stained scrubs who fights for children nobody else cares about. I fell in love with you." The confession hung in the air, louder than the music. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The wall she had built, the pillow fortress, the anger, it all crumbled. He loved her. The contract was a lie, but the love was real.
She opened her mouth to speak, to tell him she loved him too, to tell him that she had been terrified of being hurt, but before the words could leave her lips, a scream tore through the ballroom. "Help! He's not breathing!" The music cut out. The crowd gasped and surged forward. James and Sarah turned. At the head table, Chairman Park had collapsed face first into his soup. Chaos erupted. People were screaming, taking photos, panicking. Daniel was standing over the old man, looking fake concerned. "Call 911!" someone shouted. Sarah didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She wasn't the fiancée in the emerald dress anymore. She was Dr. Mitchell. She ripped the high heels off her feet, hiked up the $1,000,000 gown, and sprinted across the ballroom floor. She dove through the crowd, sliding on her knees to the chairman's side. "Back up! Everyone, back up!" she screamed, her voice commanding the room. She checked his pulse. Thready. His lips were blue. Anaphylaxis, she diagnosed instantly. He's having an allergic reaction. His airway is closing. She looked up at James, who was right beside her. "I need an EpiPen. Does he carry one?" James patted the old man's pockets frantically. "No, he's not allergic to anything." Sarah looked at the soup. Shellfish. Someone had spiked it. This was murder. "He has 10 seconds before his throat closes," Sarah yelled. "I need a knife and a straw. Now!" The crowd gasped. Daniel stepped forward. "She's crazy. She's going to kill him. Get her away." Security guards moved in. Sarah looked at James. This was it. The trust test. "James," she said, locking eyes with him, "if I don't cut his throat to open an airway, he dies right now. Trust me." James looked at the guards. He looked at Daniel. Then he looked at the woman he loved. He stood up, blocking the guards, his stance wide and dangerous. "Let her work," James roared. "Anyone who touches her answers to me." Sarah grabbed a steak knife from the table. She didn't have lidocaine. She didn't have a scalpel. She poured vodka over the blade, felt for the landmarks on the old man's neck, and prayed. She made the incision. Blood sprayed under her green dress. The crowd screamed. She inserted the cocktail straw. 1 second, 2 seconds, a wheezing sound. Then, a breath. The chairman's chest rose. He was alive. Sarah slumped back, her hands covered in blood, shaking. The room was deadly silent. James dropped to his knees, pulling her into his arms, burying his face in her neck. "You did it. You saved him." But the nightmare wasn't over. As the sirens wailed in the distance, Daniel pointed a shaking finger at Sarah. "Look at the soup. She poisoned him. She poisoned him so she could save him and play the hero. Arrest her." The police burst through the doors. They saw a woman with a knife covered in blood standing over a billionaire. They didn't see a hero. They saw a suspect. James stood up, shielding Sarah with his body, but for the first time, even his money couldn't stop the handcuffs from clicking around her wrists. "James!" Sarah cried out as they pulled her away. "I didn't do it!" James watched her being dragged away, his heart shattering. He turned to Daniel, his eyes cold and dead. "You missed, and now I'm gonna burn the world down to get her back." The steel bars of the holding cell were cold against Sarah's forehead, but the ice in her veins came from fear, not the temperature. She sat on the thin, hard bench of the NYPD precinct, her emerald green gown, now ruined with the blood of the man she tried to save, spread around her like a tragic, wilting flower. It had been 4 hours since they dragged her out of the ballroom, 4 hours of questions she couldn't answer, 4 hours of knowing that Daniel had won. She closed her eyes, replaying the moment James had looked at her as the handcuffs clicked. He hadn't looked away. He hadn't doubted her. But what could one man do against a room full of witnesses and a poisoned bowl of soup? She was a doctor from the Bronx. Daniel was a park. The narrative was already written. The gold digger tried to kill the patriarch for the inheritance. If you want to see how true love burns down a kingdom of lies to build a paradise, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because this ending is going to be legendary. Suddenly, the heavy metal door at the end of the corridor slammed open with a violence that made the guard jump. Footsteps echoed on the concrete, fast, heavy, authoritative. Sarah stood up, gripping the bars. James didn't walk in, he stormed in. He was still wearing his tuxedo, but the tie was gone, the collar unbuttoned, and his eyes were bloodshot. He looked like a man who had walked through hell to get to the other side. Behind him trailed the police commissioner, looking pale and apologetic, and a lawyer who cost $5,000 an hour. "Open it," James commanded, his voice a low growl that vibrated in the small space. The guard fumbled with the keys. The moment the lock clicked, James didn't wait. He pushed the door open and pulled Sarah into his arms, crushing her against him so hard she gasped. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair, his hands trembling. "I'm so sorry I let them take you." Sarah buried her face in his chest, smelling the lingering scent of sandalwood and the sweat of his panic. "Did they believe you?" she asked, her voice muffled. "Is Daniel—" James pulled back, framing her face with his hands. "Daniel is celebrating. He thinks it's over, but he forgot one thing." James's eyes darkened with a terrifying intelligence. "He forgot that I own the hotel, and I own the cameras he thought he turned off." The drive to the hospital was a blur of speed and silence. James held Sarah's hand the entire way, refusing to let go even to shift gears. He explained what he had found in the kitchen. Daniel had bribed the sous chef to spike the soup with peanut oil. It was clumsy, it was arrogant, and it was caught on a backup security server that Daniel didn't know existed because James had installed it secretly months ago during a security audit. The footage showed Daniel handing the chef an envelope. It showed Daniel smiling as the soup went out. It was a smoking gun, but the bullet hadn't been fired yet. "We're going to the hospital," James said, his jaw set. "My grandfather is awake. Daniel is with him right now, trying to get him to sign a new will disinheriting me and incriminating you. We have about 10 minutes before the ink dries." Sarah looked at her blood-stained hands. "James, I can't go in there. I look like a criminal." James glanced at her, his expression softening. "You look like a warrior, Sarah. You saved his life, and tonight you're going to take yours back." They burst into the VIP suite of Mount Sinai Hospital just as Daniel was placing a pen in the chairman's trembling hand. The old man looked pale, hooked up to monitors, his throat bandaged where Sarah had made the incision. Daniel looked up, his face twisting in shock. "Security," he shouted. "Get them out. She tried to kill him." James didn't stop. He walked straight to the foot of the bed, pulled out a tablet and pressed play. The video of the kitchen bribe played on the large screen on the wall. The silence in the room was absolute. Daniel froze. The color drained from his face until he looked like a ghost. The chairman watched the video, his eyes narrowing. He watched his grandson pay a chef to poison him. He watched the betrayal unfold in high definition. Then, slowly, painfully, the old man turned his head to look at Daniel. "You," the chairman rasped, his voice weak but filled with venom that made Daniel flinch. "You tried to kill me for money?" Daniel stammered, backing away. "Grandfather, no, it's a deep fake. James made it. He's trying to frame me." But the chairman wasn't listening. He looked at Sarah. He looked at the blood stained on her dress. He looked at the bandage on his own neck. He remembered the darkness closing in, the inability to breathe, and then the sharp pain that brought the air back. He remembered the woman in green fighting the guards to save him. He lifted a shaking hand toward her. Sarah stepped forward, taking it gently. "You," the chairman whispered. "You didn't hesitate. You cut me." Sarah nodded, tears pricking her eyes. "I had to. You were dying." The chairman squeezed her hand, surprisingly strong. "You have steady hands, Dr. Mitchell, the hands of a surgeon, the hands of a park." He turned to James. "Call the police. Tell them my grandson is in this room, but not the one standing by the door." James nodded, a grim satisfaction settling on his face. "Already done, grandfather." As the sirens approached outside, Daniel tried to run, but James stepped in his path. It wasn't a fight, it was a dismissal. James simply shoved him back into the chair. "Sit down, Daniel," James said quietly. "The show is over." 3 months later, the snow was falling softly on the Bronx, turning the grid of the city into something magical. But the St. Jude's Clinic didn't look like a fortress anymore. It looked like a beacon. The brick had been restored, the roof was brand new, and a shiny plaque by the door read, "The Mitchell Park Pediatric Center." Inside, it was warm and bright. Sarah was in her office, not the cramped closet she used to have, but a real office with windows, checking the vitals of Mia, the little girl with the heart condition. "All clear," Sarah smiled, taking off her stethoscope. "Your heart sounds like a drum, Mia." The little girl giggled, hopping off the table. "Can I go to the party now?" Sarah nodded. "Go, but don't eat all the cake." Mia ran out into the waiting room, which was decorated with streamers and balloons. Today was the grand reopening, fully funded by the Park Foundation. Sarah stood up, smoothing her white coat. She walked out into the hallway, feeling a peace she hadn't known was possible. She had kept her job, she had kept her independence, but she had gained something else. James was standing by the reception desk holding a massive bouquet of wildflowers, not expensive roses, but the kind Sarah actually liked. He wasn't wearing a suit, he was wearing jeans and a sweater, looking younger, softer, happier. When he saw her, his face lit up. "Doctor," he nodded, "I have a complaint. My heart has been racing for 3 months straight. I think I need a consult." Sarah laughed, walking into his arms. "I think you'll survive, Mr. Park." He kissed her, a slow, sweet kiss that tasted of coffee and forever. "The contract expires today," James murmured against her lips. 1 year. Well, technically 3 months, but who's counting? "The deal is done. You're free." Sarah pulled back, looking into his eyes. "I don't want to be free," she whispered. "I want to renegotiate." James reached into his pocket. No velvet box this time, just a simple gold band, warm from his hand. "I have a new offer," he said, dropping to one knee right there in the waiting room amidst the coughing patients and running children. "Lifetime tenure, no exit clause, shared assets, shared dreams, and shared pillows. Will you marry me, Sarah, for real this time?" The waiting room went silent. The receptionist gasped. Mia peeked out from behind a chair. Sarah looked at the ring, then at the man who drove into the Bronx in a sports car to buy a fake wife and ended up finding his soul. She didn't think about the money. She didn't think about the status. She thought about the way he stood between her and the world. She thought about the way he looked at her when she was covered in blood and exhaustion. "Yes," she whispered, tears spilling over. "Yes, you idiot, yes." James stood up and kissed her again, and the clinic erupted in cheers. The orphans clapped, the nurses cried, and somewhere in a penthouse in Manhattan, a grumpy old chairman smiled as he watched the live stream on his tablet. They say love is a transaction, a business of give and take. But as James held Sarah in the middle of the clinic that love built, they both knew the truth. Love isn't a contract. It's the only thing in the world you can't buy, but it's the only thing worth dying for. And for the CEO and the doctor, it was just the beginning.